Gabriele D'Annunzio, an astrological portrait by Ciro Discepolo. Gabriele D'Annunzio was a great rhetorician. This was one of the conclusions reached by the June episode of Mixer Cultura, entirely dedicated to the commemoration of the great Abruzzese poet, whose 50th anniversary of death was being celebrated this year. Amidst hosannas and condemnations, once again the author of The Pleasure, Il Piacere, The Nocturni, Il Notturno, The Secret Book, Il Libro Segreto, and many other masterpieces of prose and poetry, divided his critics 180 degrees, with Enzo Siciliano extolling him and insisting that he belonged to the 20th century and not the 19th, with differently oriented historians placing him among the staunch fascists and others among the opportunists loyal to the regime, with the Siamese twins, Frutero and Lucentini, who I believe never distinguished their positions more than on this occasion, and with those who recalled that the great Ungaretti, many years ago after listening to a long celebration of the poet, stood up shouting, "I started writing poetry out of hatred for Gabriele D'Annunzio." And if some of the greatest names in Italian literature that evening did not agree on the question of whether 20th century poetry is all in the image and likeness of that of the poet from Pescara, or if, on the contrary, it is its most total negation, I certainly will not attempt to offer such a lofty judgment, and will limit myself to observing D'Annunzio, the man, through the facts of his life. These facts have been narrated to us by a plethora of writers, from Antonelli to De Roma, from Sozzi to Julian, and many others, but the biography I like the most, and which is an Oscar Mondadori not by chance, is the one written by the late Piero Chiara, essential, seriously impartial, and sparse on personal comments. And so, with books on one side, note-taking paper in front, and the natal chart on the other, I too plunged in to seek some truth without conclusive and/or irreversible claims. So Gabriele D'Annunzio was born in Pescara on March 12, 1863, at 8:00 a.m., and his horoscope with Sun, Venus, and Neptune in the 12th house, Mars in the first, and Pluto on the ascendant, is highly convincing to me. His entire story is mirrored in this chart, which marks the ascendant at 3 degrees and 36 minutes, in Taurus, and the moon at 14 degrees and 47 minutes in Sagittarius. Let's start with money, for example. Our subject sailed in a sea of debts his whole life. He spent everything he had, and then, without any apparent concern, he also spent what he would earn 10 or 20 years later. He loved luxury, the good life, women above all, racing dogs and horses, villas, art paintings, oriental rugs, precious fabric curtains, and 1,000 objects that today we would not hesitate to define as kitsch. To give an idea of the enormous disproportion between what he spent and what he could afford to spend, suffice it to say that in 1898 he had 10,000 lire in debt, which he could have redeemed for less than 3,000 lire for every new book he delivered. His economic condition could be defined as volcanic, and so it appears if we note Uranus in the second house, opposing the moon and squaring the sun. One would be tempted to adjust the birth time and place Mars in the second house as well, but that would be a mistake and also useless. We will see why later. First, we observe that Mercury, dispositor of the second in the 11th, trines Jupiter and clearly indicates that the subject always managed to get by, relying on the help of his patrons, who were his patient publishers, influential friends, and sometimes even prestigious lovers such as Eleonora Duse, who reciprocated his amorous fire with emeralds and substantial funding. Mars in the second would not have made his long economic history full of seizures, escapes, pawned objects, and even frauds in the sense of unkept commitments for which he had been heavily paid, any more dramatic. No, Mars is well placed in the first. Otherwise, how would one explain his inexhaustible energy that he managed to express sexually or by writing, as is fitting for a Mars in Gemini? Mars in the first house was energy, but it was also a notable series of accidents he encountered throughout his life. He fell many times, sometimes from a horse, lost 2 incisors in an accident when very young, and was later deprived of sight in one eye after hitting his head on the machine gun of one of the planes with which he won 3 silver medals, 1 gold medal, and countless minor honors, not independently of the pressures he exerted to obtain them. Mars, therefore, also represents the courage he expressed, perhaps to the maximum, in the flyover of Vienna and the dropping of satirical leaflets on it. Later, when his sexual libido was curbed and the years stifled the potential flames of his heart for his homeland, the fiery planet would express itself in the many ailments that physically afflicted him, especially with a stomach ulcer that I cannot explain, and with hemorrhoids, Pluto conjunct the ascendant. But let's return for a moment to the second house and the disaster of his finances. I bet that whoever among those reading me has the same or a similar astral position, lacking adequate experience, is breaking out in a cold sweat. In my opinion, there is no reason for this unless the similarity with D'Annunzio's entire natal chart is very strong. We must not forget, in fact, the primary element of analysis of this horoscope. The Sun and 2 planets are in the 12th house. This means many trials, a continuous daily struggle. So if we add Uranus in the second, in discordant aspects with the luminaries, this is where the enormous problems of sustenance emerge. The Pisces values were all expressed, from the sensuality and self-indulgence that conveyed most of his libido to the mystical vocation repeatedly expressed in the desire to enter a convent, to the nursing sense with which he cared for all the women he had relationships with. A devoted and vigilant nurse when his women fell ill, even when choked by debts and with creditors breathing down his neck, a little money miraculously reached him. He thought of sending a portion to one of the many lovers, who, like almost all the women who loved him, met a bad end. He was very selfish towards his children, his soon-abandoned wife, and his poor mother, who stood on the balcony of their Pescara house for almost an entire lifetime to see the famous son arrive, who only dedicated a few hours to her once. He kept his women somewhat like bitches, and forced them to tolerate each other, since he never gave himself exclusively to one of them, and often invited more than one into his bed. He was an erotomaniac to the maximum power, or depraved, as would be said today, and as those who did not share his bizarre behaviors, never equaled even by professional pornographers, said back then. But even on this point, 50 years after his death, the poet would be capable of causing profound differences of opinion between those who believe that having their lover defecate on their chest is erotic sophistication, and those who, instead, would classify it as a red light outrage. Evidently, his Pluto near the ascendant was also this, in addition to the unconscious search for death, also recalled by the moon in the 8th house, and antagonized by the Sagittarius and Taurus values, which are all for life. He sought glorious death in war several times, but always survived, while many of his pilots, on the days he remained grounded, never returned. He was also Pisces in his superstitions, and wrote 1912 plus 1 instead of 1913, in addition to always carrying various talismans with him, deuces, emeralds, his mother's wedding ring, and a large terracotta phallus, sacred and profane, had always mixed within him in a confusion that often envelops many Pisces. He believed a prophecy that had been made to him which said he would die a violent death in 1909, but then he did not hesitate to fight in a duel and was wounded twice, Mars in the first house. I spoke earlier of his rhetoric. Here is an example taken from a speech he made on January 2nd, 1921, against fratricidal strife. If he who wept at Lazarus's grave, if the Son of Man now appeared between the altar and the coffins, between the sacred tablecloth and the holy banner, between the lit candles and the extinct lives, if he appeared here and cried out and resurrected these discordant dead from the yet unnailed covers, I believe that they would not rise except to sob and to grant forgiveness and to embrace. Evidently, his greatest charisma came to him whether he spoke or wrote from the Pluto dominant. Mars in the first house contributed to enhancing this charisma. He inflamed many crowds and was among the major protagonists of interventionism in the First World War. As a cavalry officer, in his dangerous and glorious aerial and maritime exploits, he perhaps lived the happiest period because it aligned with his 12th house values of struggle and the martiality already described. When the war ended, he felt a great sadness, and in his own way continued it for a while with the Fiume enterprise. Then, as is known, he retired to Gardone Riviera on Lake Garda, to the villa that would be named the Vittoriale degli Italiani. Mussolini, now in power, found a way to understand him, even though D'Annunzio called him comrade when he wrote to him. He was assigned a permanent spy in the house, and in exchange for his adherence to fascism, Mussolini subsidized him abundantly. The poet, for his part, used the last years of his life expressing the Red Cross valencies of his sign, and wrote floods of letters to the Deuce to get him to assign jobs to needy friends, to request political positions for old friends, and even for the spy Rizzo. When he died of a stroke on the evening of February 28, 1938, the latter requested an urgent telephone communication with the Duce, and the operator heard her finally during the call. To measure what D'Annunzio represented for Italians, suffice it to say that the next day the first 3.5 pages of the Corriere della Sera were entirely dedicated to the man for whom the state was already publishing the opera Omnia. By studying his restless life and his horoscope, one can grasp 100 faces that belong to him, but in judging them we must not forget an important parameter, the most important of all. He was and is one of Italy's greatest men of letters. Published in the book Da Costanzo a Nilde Iotti by Ciro Discepolo, Edizioni Ricerca 90, Naples, 1992.